The bulldozer's engine roared to life at 6 a.m. sharp, its massive steel blade gleaming in the morning sun as it lurched toward my grandfather's century-old cabin. I stood there in my pajamas, coffee mug trembling in my hands, watching Margaret Whitmore, the HOA president, with her perfectly coiffed silver hair and predatory smile, directing the demolition crew like she was conducting a symphony of destruction. "You have exactly 30 minutes to remove your belongings before we level this eyesore," she called out, her voice carrying across the pristine lake like a death sentence. The other HOA board members stood behind her in their matching polo shirts, nodding in smug satisfaction as if they were about to rid the world of some great evil. But what Margaret didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I held something in my possession that would turn their perfect little lakefront community into their worst nightmare. The manila envelope sitting on my kitchen table contained documents that would make every single one of them homeless within the month. Let me back up 6 months, because this story doesn't start with bulldozers. It starts with a funeral. My grandfather, Thomas McKinnon, had passed away at 93, leaving me his most precious possession, a weathered log cabin on the shores of Crystal Lake. The place had been in our family since 1924, back when the entire area was nothing but wilderness and dreams. Grandpa Tom had built it with his own hands, log by log, nail by nail, creating what he called the last piece of America that money can't corrupt. I'd spent every summer there as a kid, learning to fish in the early morning mist, building campfires that crackled against the star-filled darkness, and listening to Grandpa's stories about the old days when the lake belonged to everyone and no one at the same time. When he died, I inherited not just the cabin, but 47 acres of pristine lakefront property that had somehow survived decades of development. The first sign of trouble came on a Tuesday in March. I was up at the cabin, going through Grandpa's things and planning some much-needed repairs, when a black BMW pulled into my gravel driveway. Out stepped Margaret Whitmore, looking like she'd been pressed and starched by a machine designed specifically for creating human disapproval. "You must be Thomas's grandson," she said, not bothering with pleasantries. "I'm Margaret, president of the Crystal Lake Homeowners Association. We need to talk." I invited her in, thinking this was some kind of welcome wagon situation. How wrong I was. Margaret sat on Grandpa's old rocking chair like she owned it, pulling out a thick folder of documents. "Your grandfather, rest his soul, was never cooperative with our community standards," she began. "This cabin is a blight on our pristine lakefront community. It violates at least a dozen HOA regulations, and frankly, it's bringing down property values for everyone else." I looked around the cabin. Sure, it was rustic, but it was clean, well-maintained, and had more character in its weathered logs than all their McMansions combined. "I'm sorry, but my family's property predates any HOA by about 70 years. We're not even part of your association." Margaret's smile could have frozen the lake in July. "Oh, but you are now, dear." When the community incorporated in 1998, all lakefront properties were automatically included. Your grandfather refused to acknowledge this, but legally, you're bound by our covenants, conditions, and restrictions. She slid a violation notice across Grandpa's handmade coffee table. The list was 3 pages long: unapproved exterior materials, non-conforming architectural style, inadequate landscaping, unpermitted dock structure, and about 20 other infractions that basically added up to your cabin exists, and we don't like it. "You have 90 days to bring the property into compliance or face seizure proceedings," Margaret announced, standing up and smoothing down her designer blazer. "I'd recommend just tearing it down and building something appropriate. I know several excellent architects who specialize in lakefront homes that actually enhance the community." The moment her BMW disappeared down the road, I was on the phone with my lawyer, Jerry Patterson, a guy who'd helped Grandpa with various legal matters over the years. Jerry's news wasn't good. The HOA incorporation was legitimate, he said, his voice heavy with frustration. They managed to get the county to approve a retroactive inclusion clause. Technically, they do have authority over your property now. But Jerry wasn't done. There's something else, though. Your grandfather left specific instructions that I was only to give you this information if the HOA ever tried to move against the property. He paused, and I could hear papers rustling. He said to tell you to check the old steamer trunk in the cabin's basement. Said you'd know what to do with what you found there. I'd been in that basement 1,000 times as a kid, but I'd never paid attention to the old trunk shoved back in the corner behind Grandpa's fishing gear. It took me 20 minutes to dig it out, and when I finally pried open the rusted latches, I found something that made my hands shake. Inside were dozens of yellowed documents, maps, and surveys dating back to the 1920s. But it wasn't just the cabin's deed I found, it was deeds to huge sections of land all around the lake, including most of the property where the HOA's precious luxury homes now stood. The story was incredible. Back in 1924, my great-great-grandfather, Samuel McKinnon, had purchased over 800 acres around Crystal Lake for practically nothing. The area was considered worthless swampland back then, too remote and wild for civilized development. But Samuel had vision. He knew that someday this pristine wilderness would be worth a fortune. The documents showed that over the decades, the McKinnon family had sold off small parcels to various buyers. But they'd retained something crucial, the mineral rights and underlying land rights to almost everything around the lake. It was a common practice in the old days, but most people forgot about these archaic legal arrangements as properties changed hands over the years. What this meant was staggering. Every single mansion in the Crystal Lake community was built on land where my family still held the underlying deed. The homeowners owned their houses, but we owned the ground they sat on. And there was more. Buried in the legal documents was something called a reversion clause if any party attempted to seize or unlawfully take possession of the original McKinnon property. My cabin, all underlying land rights, would immediately revert to the McKinnon family, giving us the legal authority to reclaim the entire area. Samuel McKinnon had been smarter than anyone realized. He'd created a legal nuclear bomb and buried it for future generations to find if they ever needed to defend the family land. But I wasn't ready to deploy that weapon yet. First, I wanted to see just how far Margaret and her HOA cronies were willing to go. Over the next month, the harassment escalated beyond anything I could have imagined. Margaret's HO hired a private investigator to spy on me, documenting every time I so much as hammered a nail or moved a piece of furniture. They filed noise complaints with the county every time I started my truck before 8 a.m. They even tried to get the health department to condemn my septic system, claiming it was contaminating the lake, a system that had been working perfectly for decades. The worst part was how they turned the other lakefront residents against me. Margaret organized a whisper campaign, spreading rumors that I was planning to turn the property into some kind of trailer park or commercial development. Suddenly, neighbors who'd waved at me for years were calling the sheriff to report suspicious activity every time I showed up at my own cabin. Then came the coup de grace. Margaret scheduled a mandatory HOA meeting for a Thursday evening in May, with exactly 24 hours notice. The agenda had one item: emergency vote on immediate seizure of non-compliant property at 1247 Lakeshore Drive. I showed up to find the community center packed with about 40 homeowners, most of whom I'd never seen before. Margaret stood at the front with a PowerPoint presentation titled "Protecting Our Community Values." For 30 minutes, she painted me as some kind of environmental terrorist who was single-handedly destroying their paradise. "This eyesore has been allowed to fester for too long," she declared, clicking through photos of my cabin that had been taken with telephoto lenses from across the lake. "Property values have already dropped 3% since this. person inherited the property. How much more are we willing to sacrifice for one man's selfishness? The vote wasn't even close. 37 in favor of immediate seizure, 2 opposed, and 1 abstention. Margaret's smile as she announced the results could have powered the entire community center. "Mr. McKinnon," she said, turning to face me directly, "you have 72 hours to vacate the property. Demolition begins Monday morning at 6 a.m. That's when I stood up, my heart pounding like a jackhammer, and said the words that would haunt Margaret Whitmore for the rest of her days. "Mrs. Whitmore, before you celebrate too much, you might want to check your own property deed. Specifically, the underlying land rights section." The confusion in her eyes was delicious. She had no idea what I was talking about, but something in my voice made her confident smile flicker for just a moment. I walked out of that meeting, knowing I had 72 hours to execute the most satisfying revenge in HOA history. The first call I made was to Jerry Patterson. "I need you to file emergency injunctions against 43 different properties around Crystal Lake," I said. "And I need you to do it before Monday morning." Jerry was quiet for a long moment. "Are you sure you want to go nuclear?" "Once we do this, there's no going back. They want to take my family's legacy and turn it into rubble," I replied. "It's time they learned that some fights you just can't win." While Jerry worked on the legal paperwork, I spent the weekend making copies of every single document from Grandpa's trunk. I organized them by property address, creating individual folders for each HOA member's home. By Sunday night, I had a complete dossier on every single person who'd voted to steal my family's land. Monday morning arrived with that bulldozer and Margaret's triumphant smile. But as she stood there, directing the demolition crew, her cell phone started ringing. Then the bulldozer operator's phone rang. Then every HOA board member's phone seemed to go off at once. I watched from my cabin porch as the confusion spread through their ranks like wildfire. Margaret answered her phone with an irritated, "What?" That quickly transformed into something approaching panic. "What do you mean, emergency injunction?" "Injunction for what?" She barked into the phone, her face going pale beneath her perfectly applied makeup. That's when Jerry Patterson's black sedan pulled into the driveway, followed by a county sheriff's patrol car. Jerry stepped out, carrying a briefcase and wearing the biggest grin I'd seen from him in years. "Mrs. Whitmore," Jerry called out, "I'm Jerry Patterson, representing Mr. McKinnon. I have some documents you're going to want to see before your crew does anything they'll regret." Margaret stormed over, her HOA board members trailing behind her like confused ducklings. "This is a legally authorized demolition. You can't stop us with some last-minute legal stunt." Jerry opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of papers. "These are court orders freezing all construction, demolition, or modification activities on 43 properties around Crystal Lake, pending resolution of underlying property rights dispute." "That's impossible," Margaret snapped. "We own our homes. We have deeds." "You have deeds to the structures," Jerry agreed. "But Mr. McKinnon's family has held the underlying land rights since 1924. And according to the original purchase agreements, any attempt to unlawfully seize the original McKinnon property triggers an immediate reversion of all land rights to the McKinnon family." I'll never forget the moment when understanding dawned on Margaret's face. It was like watching someone realize they'd been standing on a trap door that was about to open. "You're saying," she whispered. "I'm saying," Jerry continued, "that as of this morning, Mr. McKinnon has the legal right to reclaim the land underneath your house, your neighbor's house, and pretty much every house in this community. You can keep your homes, but you'll need to find somewhere else to put them." The bulldozer operator, who'd been listening to this exchange with growing alarm, shut off his engine and started making phone calls to his dispatcher. The rest of the demolition crew began packing up their equipment without being asked. But the real show was just getting started. Margaret tried to maintain her composure, but I could see her hands shaking as she scrolled through her phone, probably calling every lawyer in the state. The other HOA board members were in full panic mode, some of them already heading back to their cars. "This is extortion," Margaret finally screamed. "You can't hold an entire community hostage because you're upset about following the rules." That's when I decided it was time to address the crowd that had gathered to watch my cabin's demolition turn into the HOA's execution. I stood up on my cabin's front porch, and the entire group fell silent. Even the lake seemed to stop lapping at the shore. "For 6 months," I said, my voice carrying across the assembled crowd, "you people have treated me like some kind of criminal because I had the audacity to inherit my grandfather's cabin. You've spied on me, harassed me, filed false reports, and now you want to tear down a building that stood here since before any of your houses existed." I could see several homeowners starting to look uncomfortable, realizing they'd been caught up in Margaret's vendetta without understanding the full situation. "But here's what's really interesting," I continued, pulling out one of the manila folders Jerry had prepared. "Margaret, your house at 1823 Lakeshore Drive? According to these documents, it's sitting on McKinnon land, has been, since your builder purchased the lot from the previous owner in 2003. Margaret's face went from pale to bright red. "That's impossible. I have a clear deed." "You have a deed to the surface rights," I corrected. "But the underlying deed, the one that gives you the right to have your house sit on that particular piece of earth that's been owned by my family since 1924. I opened another folder. "Bill Henderson, your place at 1847 Lakeshore Drive? Same situation. Patricia Collins, 1901 Lakeshore Drive? McKinnon land." One by one, I called out the addresses of every HOA board member, watching their faces crumble as they realized the magnitude of what they'd walked into. "Now," I said, "I want to make something very clear. I don't want to take anyone's home. I don't want to destroy this community. All I ever wanted was to be left alone to maintain my family's cabin in peace." The crowd was dead silent now, hanging on every word. "But you decided to declare war on me. You voted to steal my family's legacy and turn it into rubble. So now we're going to resolve this my grandfather's way." I held up a thick stack of legal documents. "Every single one of you who voted to seize my property now has 48 hours to vacate your homes while we sort out these underlying property rights issues." The county has been very cooperative in expediting the paperwork. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Half the crowd started shouting at once, some at me, some at Margaret, some at each other. Several people were already on their phones, presumably calling lawyers or real estate agents or moving companies. But Margaret wasn't done fighting yet. "This is blackmail," she screamed, pushing through the crowd toward my porch. "You can't force an entire community out of their homes over some technicality." "Technicality?" I replied calmly. "Margaret, you just tried to bulldoze my home over architectural-style guidelines. If that's not a technicality, I don't know what is." That's when Jerry stepped forward with another folder. "Mrs. Whitmore, there's something else you should know. We've done some research into the HOA's finances, specifically the legal fees you've been charging to the community fund for this action against Mr. McKinnon." Margaret's expression shifted from rage to something approaching terror. "It turns out," Jerry continued, "that using HOA funds to pursue personal vendettas against community members is considered embezzlement under state law. The district attorney's office is very interested in reviewing the expenditures." I watched Margaret's world collapse in real time. Not only was her home potentially forfeit, but she was looking at criminal charges for misusing the community's money to fund her personal war against my cabin. Several HOA board members were already distancing themselves from her, literally stepping away as if her legal troubles might be contagious. But the best part was yet to come. Jerry pulled out one final document. There's also the matter of the environmental survey your HOA commissioned last month to support your claim that Mr. McKinnon's septic system was contaminating the lake. I hadn't heard about this, but Jerry's grin told me it was about to be very good news for my side. It turns out the lake contamination is real, Jerry continued, but it's not coming from the McKinnon property. It's coming from 3 specific houses whose septic systems were installed without proper permits and environmental oversight. He handed Margaret a copy of the report. Houses at 1823, 1847, and 1901 Lakeshore Drive. Margaret's house. Bill Henderson's house. Patricia Collins's house. The 3 most vocal HOA board members who'd led the charge against my cabin were the ones actually polluting the lake they claimed to be protecting. The irony was so perfect it felt scripted. Over the next week, Crystal Lake experienced what the local newspaper called the most spectacular homeowners association collapse in county history. Margaret Whitmore was arrested on embezzlement charges after investigators discovered she'd spent over $30,000 in HOA funds on lawyers, private investigators, and other expenses related to her personal campaign against my cabin. She was also hit with environmental fines for her illegal septic system. Bill Henderson and Patricia Collins faced similar environmental violations. All 3 were forced to sell their homes to pay legal fees and fines, and none of them could find buyers willing to purchase houses sitting on land with clouded ownership rights. The rest of the community found themselves in legal limbo. Their homes were safe. I had no intention of actually displacing 40 families, but the underlying property rights issue made it nearly impossible to sell or refinance their properties. That's when I made them an offer they couldn't refuse. I called a community meeting for the following Thursday, this time in my cabin's backyard with the lake as a backdrop. About 30 homeowners showed up, most of them looking like they hadn't slept in days. "I know you're all scared," I began. "And I know most of you got caught up in Margaret's crusade without really understanding what was happening. So here's what I'm proposing." I'd had Jerry draft a new agreement, a real community covenant that would protect everyone's interests while ensuring my family's cabin could never again be threatened. "I'll transfer clear title to your underlying land rights for a nominal fee of $1 per property," I announced. In exchange, the community agrees to a new HOA structure where any changes to property use or regulations require a unanimous vote from all affected parties. The relief in the crowd was palpable. People were actually crying. "There's just one more condition," I continued. "The community will establish a historical preservation fund to maintain properties of significant cultural or historical value. My cabin will be the first property protected under this designation, but it won't be the last." The vote was unanimous. 37 in favor, 0 opposed. Within a month, Crystal Lake had transformed from a battle zone into something approaching a real community. Without Margaret's divisive leadership, neighbors started talking to each other again. Property values stabilized and actually began to rise as the legal uncertainty disappeared. I spent that summer fixing up the cabin, but now instead of working alone, I had volunteers. Bill Peterson, who lived 3 houses down, turned out to be a master carpenter. Linda Walsh, from across the cove, was a landscape designer who helped me create a native plant garden that actually enhanced the cabin's rustic charm. The best part was the kids. Without the HOA's restrictions on non-conforming activities, families started using the lake again. Kids were fishing off my dock, building campfires on the beach, and learning the same wilderness skills my grandfather had taught me decades earlier. Margaret's house sold at auction for about 60% of its previous value. The buyer was a young family with 3 kids who loved the lake and didn't care about having the biggest mansion in the community. They even asked me for advice on building a proper fire pit in their backyard. As I write this, it's been 2 years since the great HOA war of Crystal Lake. The cabin my grandfather built still stands on the shore, its weathered logs and handmade details more appreciated now than ever. I've added a small plaque by the front door that reads, McKinnon Family Cabin Est. 1924 defended 2024. But the real victory isn't that I saved the cabin. It's that I learned something my grandfather had been trying to teach me all along. Sometimes the most powerful weapon you can have is patience and the willingness to let your enemies defeat themselves. Margaret Whitmore thought she could use legal technicalities and community pressure to take what didn't belong to her. She never realized that my family had been playing the long game for a century, waiting for someone exactly like her to make exactly the mistake she made. These days, when new people move to Crystal Lake, they hear the story of the HOA president who tried to bulldoze the wrong cabin. It's become a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked authority and the importance of understanding your community's real history before you try to change it. And sometimes, on quiet evenings, when the lake is like glass and the loons are calling across the water, I sit on the same porch where my grandfather used to tell his stories, and I think about how proud he would be that his great-great-grandfather's century-old legal strategy finally got its moment to shine. But Margaret's story doesn't end with her arrest. What happened next turned our little victory into something that would make headlines across 3 counties. 3 months after Margaret's house sold at auction, I was sitting on my dock, enjoying a peaceful Saturday morning when I heard screaming from across the lake. Not the good kind of screaming you hear from kids jumping off docks. This was pure, unadulterated terror. I grabbed my binoculars and focused on Margaret's old property. The new owners, the Peterson family, were standing in their yard pointing at something near their foundation. Even from across the water, I could see that something was seriously wrong. By the time I rowed across the lake, half the neighborhood had gathered around the Peterson house. What I saw there made my blood run cold. The family had been landscaping their yard, trying to create a garden where Margaret's pristine but sterile lawn used to be. When they started digging near the foundation, they'd uncovered something that explained a lot about Margaret's obsession with maintaining her perfect image. Buried 3 feet under her prize-winning rose garden was a collection of documents that made my grandfather's trunk look like a grocery list. Financial records, correspondence, and what appeared to be evidence of systematic fraud going back 15 years. Tom Peterson, the new homeowner, was holding a plastic bag containing dozens of falsified HOA financial reports. "There's more," he said, his voice shaking. "A lot more. Bank statements, forged invoices, contracts with companies that don't exist. Margaret's been stealing from the community fund for over a decade. But that wasn't the worst part. Sarah Peterson, Tom's wife, led me around to the back of the house where they'd been digging a vegetable garden. In a waterproof container buried beneath where Margaret's gazebo used to stand, they'd found something that connected our little HOA drama to a much larger criminal enterprise. "Look at this," Sarah whispered, showing me a folder marked Lakeview Development Corp. Inside were blueprints, environmental surveys, and correspondence with city planners that painted a picture of corruption that went far beyond stealing HOA dues. Margaret hadn't just been embezzling money, she'd been working with a development company to systematically force out longtime lake residents so they could buy up properties cheap and build a luxury resort. My grandfather's cabin wasn't just an eyesore to her, it was the biggest obstacle to a multi-million-dollar development scheme. The documents showed that Margaret had been receiving payments from Lakeview Development for every property owner she could drive out of the community. The harassment campaigns, the ridiculous violations, the legal intimidation, it was all part of a coordinated effort to empty the lake so developers could swoop in. And here's the kicker. The environmental contamination that had been blamed on lakefront septic systems? It was intentional. Lakeview Development had been dumping chemicals into the lake's tributary streams to create the very contamination problems that would justify condemning existing properties. Within hours, the Petersons' backyard looked like a crime scene. State investigators, FBI agents, and environmental protection officers swarmed the property, carefully excavating what turned out to be Margaret's insurance policy against her criminal partners. It seems Margaret had been documenting everything, creating a paper trail that would protect her if the development scheme ever fell apart. She just never expected to lose her house and have all her evidence discovered by a family that actually cared about gardening. The investigation exploded outward like ripples on the lake. Within a week, 3 city council members had been arrested. The county planning commissioner resigned in disgrace. Lakeview Development's offices were raided, and their CEO was found trying to board a plane to a non-extradition country. But the most shocking revelation came when investigators traced the money trail back to its source. The development scheme wasn't just about Crystal Lake. It was part of a statewide operation that had been systematically targeting rural lake communities across the region. HOA presidents in 12 different communities had been recruited to drive out longtime residents using the same playbook Margaret had used against me. My little cabin had accidentally become ground zero for exposing one of the largest real estate fraud schemes in state history. The trials took 2 years to work their way through the courts. Margaret, faced with evidence of her crimes, literally dug up from her own backyard, agreed to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence. She got 8 years in federal prison and had to pay restitution to dozens of families whose lives she'd destroyed. But the real justice came in the form of the Lakefront Community Protection Act, legislation passed by the state that made it illegal for HOAs to enforce regulations that hadn't been approved by a 2/3 majority of all community members. The law was nicknamed the McKinnon Act in honor of my grandfather's cabin. During Margaret's sentencing hearing, I was asked to provide a victim impact statement. Standing at that podium, looking at the woman who'd tried to bulldoze my family's legacy, I felt something I hadn't expected: pity. "Your Honor," I said, "Margaret Whitmore spent 15 years of her life building what she thought was the perfect community. But perfection, based on lies, theft, and the destruction of other people's dreams, isn't perfection at all. It's just elaborate emptiness." I paused, looking directly at Margaret for the first time since her arrest. The saddest part is that if she'd just knocked on my door that first day and asked me to work with her to make the community better, I would have said yes. My grandfather always said that the best neighbors are the ones who help each other solve problems instead of creating them. Margaret didn't look up during my statement, but I saw her shoulders shaking. Whether it was remorse, anger, or just the weight of her collapsed world, I couldn't tell. The environmental cleanup took another year. Lakeview Development was forced to pay for remediation efforts that cost over $2 million. The lake's water quality actually improved to levels not seen since the 1960s, and fish populations exploded as the contamination was removed. Property values around Crystal Lake didn't just recover, they soared. But this time, it wasn't because of McMansions and manicured lawns. People wanted to live in the community that had fought back against corruption and won. The story had been covered by national media, turning Crystal Lake into a symbol of grassroots resistance against corporate greed. Real estate agents started marketing properties with phrases like authentic lakefront living and historic community character. My grandfather's cabin, which Margaret had called an eyesore, became the most photographed building on the lake. Tour boats started including it on their routes, with guides telling the story of how one family's century-old legal strategy had brought down a criminal empire. I never expected to become a local celebrity, but that's what happened. I was invited to speak at community planning conferences, HOA reform seminars, and environmental protection events. People wanted to hear how ordinary citizens could fight back against systematic corruption. The most rewarding speaking engagement was at a conference for rural lake communities. I met dozens of families who'd been targeted by similar schemes, people who'd lost homes, businesses, and family legacies to developers using the same playbook that had been tried on me. But I also met the heroes folks who'd fought back successfully, using everything from historical research to environmental lawsuits to media campaigns. There was a whole network of people who'd learned to turn David and Goliath fights into David and Goliath victories. One woman, Janet Mueller from Pine Lake, had defeated a similar scheme by discovering that her HOA president was secretly related to the development company trying to buy her community. Another man, Robert Chen from Sunset Shores, had exposed fraudulent environmental reports by hiring his own scientists and proving that contamination was being caused by the developers themselves. We started calling ourselves the Lake Defense Network, an informal group that shared strategies, resources, and moral support for communities under attack. What had started as my personal fight to save one cabin had grown into a movement to protect rural lake communities across the entire region. Today, 5 years after that bulldozer showed up in my driveway, Crystal Lake is thriving in ways Margaret Whitmore never could have imagined. The community center hosts environmental education programs. The Lake Association organizes cleanup events and wildlife conservation projects. Kids from the city come up for summer camps that teach wilderness skills and environmental stewardship. My cabin has become the unofficial headquarters for the Lake Defense Network. On weekends, you'll find environmental lawyers, investigative journalists, and community organizers sitting around my grandfather's handmade kitchen table, planning strategies to protect other communities facing similar threats. The old steamer trunk where I discovered my family's legal weapons now sits in a place of honor in my living room, its contents photocopied and stored in multiple locations. But it's not just a historical artifact anymore. It's become a symbol of the importance of preserving family history and community memory. Last month, I was contacted by a historian from the State University who wants to include Crystal Lake in a book about successful grassroots resistance movements. She interviewed me for hours about the legal strategy, the community organizing, and the environmental activism that had grown out of our fight. But what she was most interested in was something I'd never really thought about: how my grandfather's generation had built legal protections that they knew they might never need to use, but that future generations might find essential. They were thinking 100 years ahead, she said. They understood that communities and families need deep roots to survive the storms that come with progress and change. I think about that a lot these days, especially when I'm sitting on my dock at sunset, watching the loons dive for fish in water that's cleaner than it's been in decades. My grandfather couldn't have known that his cabin would become the center of a statewide corruption investigation, but he understood something important about the relationship between land, community, and justice. The cabin is more than just a building now. It's a testament to the idea that ordinary people can defeat powerful interests if they're patient, persistent, and willing to dig deep into history to find the tools they need. Margaret Whitmore is scheduled for release in 3 years. I wonder sometimes if she'll ever understand that the eyesore she tried to destroy ended up saving dozens of communities and protecting thousands of families from the same fate she'd planned for me. But mostly, I think about the future. The Lake Defense Network has grown to include over 200 communities across 5 states. We've stopped dozens of fraudulent development schemes and helped pass protective legislation in multiple states. What started as one man's fight to save his grandfather's cabin has become a movement that's changing how rural communities protect themselves from predatory development. And sometimes, late at night, when the lake is perfectly still and the stars are reflected in the water like diamonds on black silk, I can almost hear my grandfather's voice carried on the evening breeze. reminding me that the best defense against those who would destroy our communities is to never forget where we came from and to always be ready to fight for what matters most. The war for Crystal Lake is over, but the fight to protect communities like ours continues every day. And as long as there are families willing to dig through old trunks, study forgotten documents, and stand up to bullies who think money and power trump justice and history, we'll keep winning battles that seemed impossible just a few years ago. Next week, I'll tell you about the Pine Lake conspiracy, how Janet Mueller's investigation into her HOA president's family connections uncovered a corruption network that stretched across 4 states and involved some very surprising political figures. But that's a story that's still making headlines, and the details will shock you even more than what we uncovered here at Crystal Lake.